Thanks, LimaCharlie, for the chance to speak today. I'm Scott Small. I'm Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence at Tidal Cyber. If you're not familiar with us, we build software solutions that help organizations actually implement threat-informed defense, which I will define in a moment. But today's talk is entirely around intelligence. What I want to provide you all with is a few practical approaches for implementing and scaling threat intelligence-informed detection engineering. And I'm really going to emphasize throughout the presentation, I've got hyperlinked, can share the slides very easily, free tools and resources to help actually streamline these workflows that I'm going to talk to today. And I'm hopeful that there's a little bit of something for everyone in today's talk. I've given variations on this primarily geared at intelligence analysts. That's entirely my background, intelligence research and analysis. But what today's focus on will hopefully be injecting intelligence into your workflows for security and detection engineering. The last workflow example that I'll be covering is especially focused on validating your detection, so a little bit more from the offensive security and red teaming side. So hopefully from kind of all angles. Still not, I'm getting a ton of lag with this slide, sorry. All right, I'll try to take this into account moving forward. All right, so I mentioned threat-informed defense. What exactly is it? We strongly believe at Tidal that threat-informed defense is not just a buzzword. It is a very important component of a security program. It's really what I want you all to take away from today's talk is it's more about the mindset of how you're approaching your day-to-day workflows. If you take anything away from today's presentation, don't worry so much about the exact steps. You may incorporate parts of those or the whole things. It's more about thinking about threats, threat intelligence, and the relevant threats to your organization as you're going about your day-to-day workflows. That's really kind of the key takeaway. All right, so here's the actual academic definition that we use at Tidal for threat-informed defense. I'll let you go ahead and read this very briefly. The key part that I'll be focusing on for today's session is the piece about understanding adversary tradecraft. And what that essentially means is threat intelligence. Man, these are not syncing up, I'm sorry. Okay, so the big secret, and I think a lot of folks probably in this room are either doing a little bit of this themselves, or at least they're using solutions to do this. Getting into and getting started with intelligence-informed security engineering is not that difficult. Again, I think a lot of us are maybe even inherently taking this process into account right now. I have a very simplified basic example of how this can work in practice. I have a recent example of a threat intelligence report around Aurora InfoStealer. I'll talk more about InfoStealers a little bit later in more depth. And what is exciting is that we are increasingly seeing the level of detail that we need to write and fine-tune detections in even public intelligence reporting, let alone things that are privately available. What this can look like, just translating directly over into detection logic. I'm going to reference many times the Sigma standard, just a generic signature standard for writing primarily endpoint detections. So there is a direct translation over from a threat intelligence report into detections. So that's all great and may seem pretty simplified. The big challenges that we're seeing and speaking with organizations in the field is how do you scale this process and especially scale it with structure? And that's what I want to kind of highlight some workflows for today. What this really comes down to and what most of the rest of the presentation will emphasize and lean on is the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. As soon as I say MITRE ATT&CK, I might intrigue some folks and I may have turned off a lot of people right away. So what I want to do, and what is often happening in our conversations with defensive teams out there in the landscape, is kind of a revisiting or reorientation, reintroduction to the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. What is extremely exciting to us is that potentially since you first heard about or last heard about MITRE ATT&CK, there is a dramatic, truly an explosion of additional, especially third-party external resources that are now mapping to or aligning with the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base that makes all of this threat-informed defense workflows so much easier and, in our opinion, actually achievable now. These are just some of the typical kind of downsides or impressions folks have had about MITRE ATT&CK. Some of this certainly can take place depending on how you're approaching it, but I want to walk through more practical approaches for actually implementing the knowledge base into your defensive efforts. So for those who aren't familiar, I'm going to have to move pretty quick through this, but just what is MITRE ATT&CK, and especially what this slide is trying to capture is kind of the value of the knowledge base. It is this alignment between a number of different elements and resources, pieces of defense, all around a unified, common, standardized language. What it really comes down to are these uniquely defined techniques and sub-techniques. They all have T codes or identifiers associated with them. Each one is unique, and that truly is kind of the power of the knowledge base, because it allows alignment and pivoting to all these other things. What you're seeing on the slide right now are the kind of official elements of the knowledge base. These are all included. You can find them on the MITRE ATT&CK website, JSON, sticks, data structures. What I was referencing, however, are all these additional, largely in this case, external resources that are now increasingly mapping to, aligning with, again, those MITRE ATT&CK identifiers. That truly is the single most valuable component of this entire kind of schema, and then we'll talk about the value adds for each of the additional pieces. What I'll be focusing on for the rest of the session are these three additional elements, so detections and hunts, offensive security capabilities, and then when I say third-party CTI, I just mean data that's not in the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base right now. It could be coming from commercial sources or certainly just OSINT, and that's actually what I largely focus on in my role. Just to give you a little bit of the sense of the scale of these additional resources that are mapping to MITRE ATT&CK, through a couple metrics up on the slide. So when we look at community repositories like the Sigma rule, just the public repository, we're dealing with thousands of detection rules or analytics, let alone things that you all might be developing custom in-house, things that your vendors might be providing to you privately. One really exciting piece is the offensive security has really kind of especially adopted MITRE ATT&CK. We have things like, I'll talk in a little bit more depth later, Atomic Red Team, it's an open source project, as well as certainly commercial providers. Mapping those tests, the Red Team tests, offensive capabilities to MITRE ATT&CK, and then CTI, both OSINT and from commercial sources. What we are doing is basically at Tidal, we have a freely available community edition available to folks. We're following the exact same data model that MITRE ATT&CK has produced and kind of injecting, adding, extending to the knowledge base, especially in my case from the CTI front. So what that's looking like is the profiles will look like just like you're used to seeing with a malware or actor group. You'll have a list of all the techniques associated with it coming from publicly available sources that we can cite and point back to. So in just a few weeks of us starting to kind of add to that knowledge base, we had already added multiples of the amount of data that MITRE ATT&CK had put in their last update. And I promise it may sound like it is not a criticism. The MITRE ATT&CK team is not trying to capture every single bit of intelligence out there. That's not what it was ever designed to do. It's providing the structure around the techniques and the formatting, and now we have all these opportunities to continue extending it. They want that extension within the community. This is just a slide kind of representing especially the CTI piece. I know it's really small. What this is essentially showing is the dramatic rate of growth within even just public threat reporting of mapping to MITRE ATT&CK. So including either inline citations or what's especially useful are these tables and appendices at the end of reports with the table of the MITRE ATT&CK techniques that were described in the detailed threat report. We've seen a 6-time increase in mapping to MITRE ATT&CK over the past 5 years, and that rate, we track this, we're actually collecting OSINT every single day and kind of processing it, looking for the techniques. This rate just continues to increase. This makes our jobs a little bit easier. It's not a silver bullet. I think I had that up on an earlier slide, and I'll kind of talk to this. MITRE ATT&CK technique in and of itself is not going to allow you to write a single detection on its own. What you need to do is then dig in and find some of those additional procedural details. There's no existing really standard for that. I'm seeing people approaching it from a few different angles. It's not really the main focus of my talk today, but I do want to acknowledge that those T codes are not going to solve entirely all of our problems, but they can be extremely valuable. And that's what I'm about to walk through in these 3 examples here. Okay, so a few approaches to using MITRE ATT&CK to kind of streamline threat intelligence and injecting that into your detection engineering workflows. The first approach we'll spend the most time on. This is probably the most common one, but it's certainly not the only one. So it's this focus on what we call, quote unquote, the top techniques. And I'll define kind of how I'm getting to that point. I'm going to base these 3 examples on real recent trends in the threat landscape. The first one is going to look at ransomware's increasing emphasis on exfiltrating data. Certainly not a net new trend whatsoever, but we're seeing actually some prominent groups that were previously focusing on encrypting the data, pressuring the victim to pay the extortion, and in some cases not doing any encryption whatsoever. They're just exfiltrating data from the environment, posting it up on the data leak site, and threatening to leak more and more of it to try to place pressure on them to pay up. So that's kind of the overall trend. The way that I'm going to illustrate this is looking at one of CISA's excellent advisories on BNLian ransomware group. It's a specific one. What we've got in the screenshot here is one of those great tables at the end of a report. What you can do with the structure behind the MITRE ATT&CK identifiers, it becomes extremely easy to recognize and essentially parse out those techniques from a given threat report. I'm going to highlight in the next slide a few scripts that can allow you to actually do that yourself, open source scripts. What you can do with this, there are other scripts, including those produced by the MITRE ATT&CK team themselves, that will allow you to take any set of parsed MITRE ATT&CK identifiers. It can be in a CSV, it can be coming from a web page like this, and turn this into a nice, neat visual on the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So you're basically just seeing a visual representation of those MITRE ATT&CK techniques in the matrix view that they have outlined. That's kind of a nice visual, but we want to talk about actually putting this intel to use. One way you can start to do that is by scaling up that process. What we do is run those scripts in the background every day on all the OSINT collections that we're doing. And I truly believe, and I've seen many teams start to kind of implement some of these processes. You can get it straight from the intel vendors if you're working with commercial sources. But what you can start to do is layer and layer and layer on those matrix views, and what that starts to give you typically is this classic heat map view where you're seeing certain techniques that are associated with multiple of those groups. It becomes very visually apparent which techniques are being talked about most often. And this is really kind of the key piece of this workflow that can be valuable for detection engineering. So kind of the threat hunt or detection hypothesis that we might be looking at is, what is the top exfiltration technique used by recently active ransomware threats? There are 18 exfiltration techniques defined in the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. What I found, I sat down and plugged these all into the reader view to get a sense of how long would it take you to process through all these reports. So what we have, this is a screenshot from the community edition, is we've tallied up 40 of the recently active ransomware threats out there in the world, the ones responsible for the most attacks. These are coming from over 80 public CTI reports. What this would take you is 3.7 working days to just literally read through those reports, let alone start to kind of parse out, useful details from them. What you can do in the matrix view is you can actually see that there's a clear front runner in the exfiltration techniques used by these ransomware groups. The MITRE ATT&CK technique is called exfiltration to cloud storage. This is using some of those legitimate services that are oftentimes abused by threat actors to pull data out of a victim environment and get it into kind of a neutral zone that the ransomware operators can then, they can host it themselves, they can throw it up on their data leak sites. So this is the answer to that kind of research question: which technique is top? A majority of the groups, or the ones that are using these techniques most often, are using this specific technique. I won't have time to get into these in detail. Again, I can provide the slides there if we're hosting them, but these are all hyperlinked. These are some open source free resources for essentially just working with MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE ATT&CK based data. So if you want to create those visuals, create those JSON files capturing the techniques, I've got a link to a page that I put on my GitHub for parsing web pages for MITRE ATT&CK techniques. Nothing revolutionary whatsoever. It looks for the T codes in a regex on a web page. Pretty straightforward. It'll automatically output into one of those visual views as well. What I'm starting to highlight, though, now is pivoting into the detection realm. So again, speaking to that piece of all these additional third-party external resources that are mapping to MITRE ATT&CK techniques, you can see that there are 10 analytics in the open source Sigma repository that map to this exfiltration to cloud storage technique. And specifically what we saw, do I dare back up? Here we go. It's in small text here, but from the CISA advisory, we saw that Bianlian was exfiltrating data to the mega.io hosting service. And what you can see, it's kind of nice to know that there's 10 Sigma analytics in total, but we can see a couple that are specifically referencing mega. So if we're trying to replicate the exact behavior that we saw in the CTI report, I think it's a lot easier and quicker to kind of get to this point. We can focus in on the technique level and then drill down and make sure we're looking at exactly the right thing. If we're not, maybe that's opportunity to write a new detection right there. So this is yet another screenshot from our free community tool. You can follow the exact same workflow in a tool produced by the Sigma team. This is actually pretty new. It's called the sigmasearchengine.com. And it allows you to search across the entire rule set by a number of different parameters, including just quick text strings in the analytics title. Same process to kind of search on. If I knew I was looking for something relating to the MegaSync service, I would just do a quick search there, and we can see a number of analytics, and some of these are going to be coming from other repositories as well beyond Sigma. All right, so moving on to example number 2. This is kind of almost the opposite approach. So previously we talked about, and I have this system running passively in the background, pull in OSINT, parse it for attack techniques, and throw it up into kind of a matrix view to very easily visually spotlight the top techniques. We can also kind of take the opposite approach and I think find some really interesting insights. So in this case, we're actually going to look at some outlier techniques, things that are not commonly used, at least amongst the subset of threats that we're looking at. And in this example, I'm going to be focusing in on credential and info stealers. So we did a deep dive research project into this earlier this year. What we've found, so we can talk all day long about this, I'll have to keep it pretty high level, but essentially the credentials that are being stolen and exfiltrated are often used later on in a variety of other follow-on attacks. They're sold on dark web marketplaces. Anyone can pop in there. It's an extremely streamlined business. What we have seen, though, as part of this trend is, as there's been more attacks, there's been more focus on defense. A lot of the most prominent info stealers these days are becoming dealt in how they operate. And what we're finding here is that it's basically just a lot more difficult to kind of detect these threats. And so with that, we did a deep dive project. So this is a very similar type of matrix that included 20 recently active info stealers across 40 CTI reports. In a lot of cases, there were actually very, very few on-host detection opportunities for these threats. And so I was initially a little bit disappointed in that, but what I came to realize is that we're actually finding opportunities, the few ones that were out there to do something like a quick endpoint detection on these, we're actually pretty easily able to spotlight them. And so the specific example that I'm going to highlight is the use of, so it's got a funny name, but it's actually a very prominent info stealer, been highly active. It's called Radamanthus Stealer. What we noticed is it was the only of the info stealers out of 20 in our matrix that was using this RunDLL 32 technique. This is by no means an obscure technique whatsoever. What you're seeing here spotlighted is that, and this is just based on MITRE ATT&CK's data. I'm sure this would scale even further if we look at other reporting. But there's actually 59 software malware that utilize this technique. So my point is it's actually pretty commonly used. but not very often by the threats in that matrix view. That was the only one. It was very clear and easy to spot in that visual view, the only stealer using that technique. So what I did from here, and this is basically just kind of a reverse process, but I hope folks are starting to see some of the value than the very first one I showed. You know, I was reading through a report, spotted some on-host detection opportunities, and just wrote a Sigma rule based on that. This is aggregating this intel at scale, looking for top techniques or outliers, and then pivoting back to the source report. Again, everything that I focus on and putting into our platform is based on OSINT sources. Certainly you can get a ton of value from the commercial ones as well, or just privileged sources in general. So what I'm doing here is pivoting back to the source report. This is from the Cyber threat research team. And it was pretty quick and easy to spot because they also had included a table of the MITRE attack techniques at the end of their report. And they highlighted the run DLL 32 use. So I think in this case, I just did Command F and found the reference within the source report, which actually gave just enough detail to be able to start thinking about a detection for Rhadamanthus's implementation of the run DLL 32 technique. After doing a little bit more research, I found that they're actually using a very specific pattern. It changes the end pieces of it, but a very specific pattern in the naming conventions of the DLL files that they use, and that's essentially the kind of key piece that I focused in on for writing a Sigma rule, which we contributed back to the public repository. I do not have a background in detection engineering whatsoever. I've been kind of sorting my way through a lot of this. A lot of it was just to kind of prove out that some of this can be done. Again, I give this presentation a lot to threat intel analysts, trying to just kind of promote this thought process and the opportunities that might exist here. So in this case, we're kind of working our way backwards into a threat report, but I actually think this is a pretty valuable detection opportunity because if we determine for whatever reason that Rhadamanthus is relevant to our organization, we know there's not very many on-host detection opportunities for the stealers. This is one potential way to kind of help fill in some of those gaps, at least to add an additional layer. Okay, our third and final example, this is the piece that's going to pull in a little bit of that in the title of the talk, talking about validating your detections. So this is the most timely of the examples. It's been a few weeks now at this point. The real world threat landscape trend that we're looking at here is increased advanced persistent threat, including nation state sponsored actors, use of LOL bins or LOLBAS, living off the land techniques and binaries. So things that are already on the system, actors taking advantage of those to try to stealthily carry out their operations, with the thinking being that this activity will blend into normal user activity. So what we saw in this case, the focus of this example is going to be really leaning on those existing resources that exist out there in the community or just that map to MITRE ATT&CK to begin with. So really what this is boiling down to is more efficiency in your operations. You want to make use, of course, of what you have already available. In the other cases, we're writing some new rules. What we're going to highlight here is from Microsoft's reporting about a group called Flax Typhoon. This is a China-aligned espionage actor group. There was also some great recent reporting around a similar organization called Volt Typhoon. This is a screenshot here on the slide of Microsoft's public threat report around this actor group. I actually like this example because it highlights some of the scripts that I use and that we've open sourced for parsing these techniques. They do kind of dig in detail. When I first found this report, I was settling in to do kind of a deep dive manual look through and try to pick out MITRE ATT&CK techniques from it. When I realized the script had run in the background and was automatically recognizing those techniques, what they did in this case, they didn't necessarily have a table, which is fine. They have hyperlinked to the MITRE ATT&CK website to the relevant techniques, which include in the URL the technique identifiers. So lo and behold, there was actually some MITRE ATT&CK data that the team had already done, and I was able to quickly spot some of those. So on the basis of that, I prioritized where within the report I wanted to dig in a little bit further, and it was also pretty clear to me where there might be some detection opportunities, just in the essence of having actually command line details contained within the report. So lots of different formats for doing this. In this case, it's just a screenshot, but it's really easy to kind of pick this apart. So what I did is I started digging a little bit more into this command line activity to try to see what is out there right now. Are there opportunities to write some new detections around this activity? What I realized, just in searching on one piece of the string of this command line, the user authentication piece, what this is doing is this is essentially one of the actor's persistence commands. What they're doing is changing a registry key to allow them to use RDP without actually authenticating to the system. So I just did a quick search. You could do this in the Sigma search engine. This is our community tool for the user authentication string. And very quickly, I was able to realize that there was actually an existing Sigma analytic for this precise activity. So just to recap, an advanced persistent threat actor group, Chinese APT, is using activity for which there are open source detection analytics already available. So just to kind of double down on that point, it's worth double checking what you might have in place already. And maybe you all are able to already detect this. I think a lot of organizations maybe are, but it's worth double checking if nothing else. So this was obviously really good news. There was, not a link to the Sigma rule in the report necessarily, but for our purposes, we were able to relay that to our users and to our clients. I'm highlighting here also just some additional emphasizing that Sigma is not the only resource for this. There were some elastic detections in their open source repository for similar types of adversary behavior. I actually think this is a really great resource, whether you're using Elastic or not. Elastic, Splunk, various organizations are open sourcing at least subsets of their rules and can be really valuable when you can search across all of it at once for finding new detection opportunities. So that's not where the story completely ends, though, in this case. I just kind of had a goal to do a little bit of research into this to begin with. So as I kept digging a little bit further, I realized that there was an existing Sigma analytic for this precise behavior. What I then realized was in terms of validating those detections, there was not actually yet an Atomic Red Team test. Atomic Red Team is an open source project for running essentially quick short scripts unit tests to validate your detections. I love using it. I mentioned I'm not a detection engineer. I'm not an adversary emulation engineer either. I found Atomic Red Team project to be extremely easy to use. So I oftentimes kind of look there. And again, it's open source, so we can share it very easily with lots of folks. What I found is that there were Atomic Red Team tests for similar types of activity, but not this precise implementation of it. And so it was extremely easy, and all I'm trying to do is kind of visually represent how these things are provided in different formats, but using all the same essential components to perform detection engineering or red team testing. There was not an Atomic Red Team test for this behavior, so I quickly wrote one up. I'm familiar with their format. They make it really easy to kind of follow. So what that allowed me to do is perform a quick closed loop just to validate that this Sigma analytic did in fact work in the system that I was using in my lab environment. So really quick and easy way, again, kind of focusing in on just some of the specific strings that are there to kind of prioritize your efforts. All right, last slide. Talked about kind of scaling up this process and also just adding more structure to it. What I want to highlight, I can and I have given entire talks just on this piece of it. This is kind of actually my primary focus in my day job, is around threat profiling. What this essentially allows you to do is to scale up these workflows that I was just talking about while allowing you to maintain focus on the threats that you actually care about. One of the quick ways, and I'm seeing a lot of interest in this kind of across the board, but especially in the MSSP environment, is by looking at essentially just threat metadata. What threats might be relevant to either your own organization or the clients that you support? Some of the key ways of narrowing down this massive universe of threat intel and groups that are out there is by looking at threats targeting or impacting organizations most like your own. You can start to filter this down on the basis of the type of threat actor it is, or what industries or sectors have they targeted, what locations have they seen being recently active in. We can quickly narrow down this massive universe, in this case to a list of 9 Chinese APTs targeting or impacting organizations in the US and the defense sector, just like Volt Typhoon and Flax Typhoon were. So just kind of a quick highlight, we've written an entire guide geared towards defenders, detection engineers especially, around how to carry out this threat profiling process. We also shared on our GitHub page the full list of resources, a lot of which I've linked in here, as well as some other ones specifically around this piece, good sources to use for kind of finding some of that threat metadata to help you narrow down this entire universe of threats. All right, I'll be around. Happy to answer questions now, later. Appreciate everyone's attention.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Anyone have any questions for Scott from Tidal before we got one? All right, hang on. Let me get the mic back there. Or you can yell. It's up to you. I'm getting, all right then. Well, I guess I'll keep walking.
So, thank you for the presentation.
Distance?
With our defenses, right, and taking a look at the tools and technologies and the licensing capabilities that we have to map to the MITRE attack techniques that we can defend against. And so something you showed earlier was making a kind of heat map from threat reports and other things, right? So if you have a heat map of your defenses and the heat map of the threats, in your opinion, is that a good approach to finding like where you have strengths and, more importantly, where you have gaps and weaknesses?
100%. Yeah, you really just nailed it. And one of the biggest challenges is just kind of organizing your defenses, finding what maps to what. If you're using solutions that provide those mappings, that's great. Sometimes you have to figure them out on your own. But that is really kind of the key to this entire workflow, is doing that alignment. From there, it just becomes different levels of depth and granularity that you go further. So it's great to know that you have, X number of rules that line up with a certain technique used by, 10 threat actors that are relevant to you. Well, then you get into the whole question of how deep is this detection? How much quote unquote coverage does it actually give me? Does it cover 100 implementations of this technique or just one very specific one? Those are all factors that you kind of have to add in kind of on your own. A lot of it comes down to scoring and weighting, and that's a big thing we work with teams to help kind of figure out. How do you weight certain techniques by their priority levels? It can come down to their importance in the kill chain. It can come down to what level of disruption would they pose. So it just kind of further rabbit holes from there, but those are all good things to be working through, and it's just going to make your alignment and assessment process just that much better. But that's the place to start. You nailed it.
Anyone else? Awesome. Thanks again, Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you.